so good evening. I'm Carisha Lewis, Assistant Director of Student Alumni Engagement and SUNY Oswego graduate student. So sorry, let me restart that. I'm the Assistant Director of Student Alumni Engagement, as well as the SUNY Oswego graduate class of both 2018 and 2021. Welcome, thank you for joining us for Imagine 2022, Navigating Through Difficult Conversations, Implicit Biases. Today's panel is sponsored by the President's Office, Career Services, and the Oswego Alumni Association. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Tonight's workshop is being recorded and you will be able to view it on Imagine 2022 website shortly. You are welcome to use the Q&A throughout tonight's event. If you have any questions, we will be monitoring them as they come in. If you haven't already, please fill out the Imagine 2022 interest form and check out the events on the Imagine 2022 website so you don't miss out on any of them. The amazing sessions for this month. The links will be shared in the chat, as you can see. And without further delay, I'm excited to introduce our fabulous panelists. I first want to say, of course, thank you to each and every one of you for making it out here tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for you guys to go ahead and introduce yourselves. So Femi, I'll let you go first since you're next on my screen.
I'm probably going first. I'll go first. All right, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name is Femi. How do you want me to introduce myself? You want like where I'm from? Like, what's their preference? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So you can go ahead and tell yourself, your class year, what you were doing as a student, and then what you're doing now.
All right. Cool. So Femi, my class year is 2015. I was studying at the time. I studied public relations. I'm from the School of Communications, of course, the best school. No, it's not. But so right now I am just a transient traveler, and I'm a consultant. So I work in the field of international education. And I work anywhere between working with federal government, US government, foreign government, K-12 institutions around intercultural learning, peace building, and human rights. That's my focus. And so I typically do projects around that, whether they're youth programs, study abroad programs, or consulting around how we transform international or K-12 schools to become more global, friendly learning environments. So that's pretty much about me. And I'm originally from New York City. So yeah.
Thank you, Femi. Yousef, you can go next.
Okay. My name is Yousef, and I graduated in 2017, so not too long ago, but it does seem like a century ago. And I was studying marketing for the School of Business. And now I work part of Citi's business strategy team. Our goal is to basically try to save money and just create a better, basic business day for our employees. So that's what I do now. And I'm originally from Brooklyn.
Thank you, Tina.
I'm Tina Cooper. I'm also a graduate of 2015, Femi. So I actually studied biochemistry during my time at SUNY Oswego. I had the opportunity to be involved in a lot of things. I actually worked for Career Services when I attended SUNY Oswego. I worked in corporate STEM for Exelon generation, nuclear generation of power. I was a specialty pharmacy patient care advocate at Noble Health Services in Syracuse. I eventually got back into higher education and worked for Casanova College as their career and internship coach. And I am currently your internship coordinator for all majors at SUNY Oswego.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, once again for coming out tonight. So we'll go ahead and just jump right into it. So before we even get into the conversation, I just want to make sure that everyone understands what implicit bias is and what we're discussing as far as our topic goes. So our definition is unintentional or unconscious thought processes conditioned to associate specific traits, characteristics, and behaviors with certain groups of people. These biases develop through repeated cultural exposure and can potentially improve our behavior towards interaction with individuals from those groups, if not monitored. So that right there all in one. I now want to pose my first question, and I just want to know everyone's personal experience as far as implicit biases go, and let us know how how are you able to overcome this? And is there anything that you would have done differently once you responded to this experience that you had? And whomever would like to jump in can definitely jump in.
How about we go ladies first? We'll go the other way.
Okay, so Tina, is it you?
Absolutely. So thank you, Yousef. I appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different ways that I personally have experienced implicit bias over the years. The biggest way for me over the years has definitely been through ability bias. I was born missing a right hand. So being not only a female working in STEM and learning a STEM field, but working in STEM with being differently abled has given me a great deal of experience in not only realizing how implicit bias exists, but also how it has affected me developmentally. It has affected me mentally. It has affected my future trajectory. There are multiple times working in STEM where I was treated differently for my disability, asked to complete tasks in a different way than a person on my team who was considered able-bodied, looked at differently throughout previous job experiences, and have had to have some very difficult conversations with supervisors, have had to really learn how to advocate for myself, how to do that in a very strategic way, unfortunately strategic way. It is always a very difficult conversation to have for yourself when needing to advocate for yourself in a job situation. Luckily, I have been able to take that experience and turn it into a positive, and have, upon realizing that I eventually wanted to probably work in higher education again, I began reframing my mindset on those experiences to turn them into learning experiences that I could eventually convey to my future students. Yeah, I mean, that ability bias has been the biggest area in the way to overcome it for me. The biggest way to overcome it in terms of that part of the question has just kind of been introspection, really looking inward and trying to find my own voice, trying to be sure that I have my own self-confidence and am not letting the opinions of others be impressionable on my own development, and kind of taking that angle of things.
Is it my turn? I can go right now. That was great though, Tina. Thanks for sharing. So if I had to share something that happened in my personal life, I would have to say the most significant one that happened where I was dealing with implicit bias was when I joined the Army. So I joined the Army and I joined a combat unit. So I was an infantry soldier. And let me tell you, it was like very rare for a guy from Brooklyn or Jersey who was also Muslim with the name I have to join an infantry unit in the Army. It was like brand new to a lot of these guys, like a lot, especially a lot, not to, stereotype, but a lot of the Southern boys. It was brand new to them. I remember my bunkmate saying, like, I've never seen a person like you in my life. And I was just like, this is crazy. I was like, you don't have TV? Like, what's going on here? And, I never thought of it as a big deal because I always grew up in a pretty diverse area until my parents moved to Jersey. So I already had that experience of just essentially dealing with all white people. And sorry to say it like that, but it was, it's definitely just what it comes down to is like people getting comfortable and getting to know you. So until that was just boot camp. So kind of jumped over that hurdle, but then you go to your company and that's a whole new beast. because you're dealing with seasoned veterans and seasoned soldiers that really they're just like shocked that you're part of their team. So one of the most like important pieces of like guidance I've ever gotten was from one of our senior leaders. And I swear at my company, it was just, I'm Moroccan. So it was me, an individual from Puerto Rico, and then one black guy. And then it was all white guys. And he was just like, just let your work ethic do all the talking. So that's exactly what I did. I busted my tail off and nobody could outperform me. And it came down to like nobody being able to question me, having their back and everything. But that was basically how I overcame implicit bias. I worked hard and educated people. I was just like, guys, just because my family's from Morocco and they're Muslim doesn't mean like, I'm not a regular American soldier. It's like I do the same thing you guys do. I watch football and all that. So that was a big piece, was the education. Now to you, Femi.
There you go. Appreciate that, Tina and Yousef, for sharing. So for me, the biggest trend that I've seen in my life in terms of implicit bias was around language and communication. So being from New York City and Brooklyn too, right? So I share that with you, Yousef, being from Brooklyn, Canarsie, there's a confluence of cultures, histories and perspectives that really shaped who I am as a person and how I interact with people. And so, speaking multiple languages and being emotionally expressive, which is a language that I've learned from a kid, where I had to, put feelings on the table as a way to solve conflict, to make sense, make meaning of, interactions. Those things is what really defined me. And so I remember a story specifically, like it was yesterday. I was with a friend. So this is more of an international story. So I remember I was living abroad in Ecuador, and I was with a friend who was from Australia, and she grew up in the United States. Well, she was born in the United States, but she grew up in Australia, and she has an Australian accent. And we met two white Americans who were working, who were missionaries, and we encountered them in Guayaquil. And I remember we just was having casual conversation, and as usual, per usual, a lot of Americans, that central question of where are you from comes up. So I remember, I told them, I was like, I'm from New York City, and I grew up in this very multicultural community in Canarsie, a community of immigrants. And my dad is being from an immigrant community. And then my friend was saying how she grew up in New York, but she identifies as Australian. Keeping in mind, like, expressing that, speak these different languages, because we were talking about languages and stuff. And they had to ask again, like, they were like, no, but where are you really from? And I'm like, New York, I'm from New York. And it's like, no, but you speak French and Spanish? And I was like, yeah. And, they couldn't sit with that. They couldn't grapple with this idea that I'm an American from New York who speak multiple languages. And that idea of language itself is not something that's a part of the American imagination, especially when you're Black. And what's so funny is that my friend, they didn't question her status at all. They even made, they alluded or explicitly stated, acknowledged that she's American, even with an Australian accent and speaking the same languages that I speak. But her identity was not in a suspect position. My identity was, because of the language that I speak, because of my communication style, and repeating that question, in a lot of ways, this coming from this implicit bias they had of me, like I'm Black and I say I'm from New York, so I might be from, the Caribbean, I might be from Africa, even this unknown country that they probably don't even know how to pronounce. And then she's white and she's Australian, but that's synonymous with whiteness in the United States. And so there's comfort in that belief that you can speak multiple languages, whereas for me, I'm a foreigner, so that's probably why I speak it. And so I love what you said, Tina, about introspection, because for a very long time, language and communication is always, whether I'm speaking like African American vernacular English, or I'm putting my own spin, like Caribbean slangs into English, or if I'm speaking French and Spanish, I always felt I was very cognizant of that, very conscious of that, and insecure because people will belittle you and treat you differently. And that introspection was really important. And going to you, Yousef, of the education, right? I had to really like relearn, educate myself about my own culture, where I learned how to communicate the way I did, and how that forged my identity, and really validating that and sitting with that and finding pride in that introspection, in that process, and being able to challenge that. You challenge people who is coming in with these questions that oftentimes are not genuine. It's you know, it's unintentional harm, and they don't even realize it, but it does disenfranchises you in that conversation. And so that's a big piece for me, and something I had to learn over the years, and that I got good at. So yeah.
Thank you. And I love how each of us have different experiences and biases. Tina, with you having physical, I want to say bias, but a physical ability or disability. Don't want to, of course, offend anyone, but and then Yousef, you speaking about the name, and then Femi, of course, you speaking about culture and everything. A lot of people don't even think about able-bodied disabilities, or even the name. The name thing is big for me, Yousef, so I completely understand where you're coming from, and just people seeing your name and expecting something, and then when they get something else, they're like, oh, whoa, what's that, for a second. So it's kind of cool, because sometimes it feels like I'm a surprise, so or like a gift for a minute. So, but each of you spoke about your personal experiences, so I wanted to go a bit into some of your professional experiences and how you guys may have overcome those moments, and if you guys have any advice for students on those experiences and how they may be able to overcome it, especially in the professional field. I know for a lot of students just coming out of college, they're not sure how to kind of stand up for themselves professionally, or not sure how to identify when implicit bias is happening, because sometimes it can be so underlying sometimes. So, can you guys speak on some of your experiences in the professional realm, and kind of some ways that you overcame it, and just some advice for students that may be experiencing that or go to a place experiencing that? And of course, it's open. Yousef, I see the mute button off, so we're gonna go to you.
I was gonna direct it to Femi. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just trying to think of one that happened professionally. So I would have to say, so there was a year I decided to make a lateral move at Citi. It was my second year there. I was like, let me make a lateral move. I was supporting our London trading desk, and I just didn't want to wake up early anymore. So I was like, let me speak over to private equity. And it was the same product. So I had no learning curve or anything. They were just gaining a top performer. And it came down to like the year-end conversation, and I was expecting what I usually get, like top ratings and all that good stuff. And I'm a weirdo. I track everything. So like I tracked all the progress, all the changes I made for them within the transfer and all that good stuff. And I came to have the discussion with my manager, and I was shocked because he gave me this average review. So one piece of advice that I would have to give students is, one, you don't have to settle for anything a manager tells you about your performance, especially if you track everything all year. You just have to professionally tell them, like, hey, I kindly disagree. And then you got to wait for the response. Like his response with me is like, well, you had a learning curve. And I was like, nope, same product, this, that, and that. I actually improved your operation, changed your operating procedures, this, that, and that. And then what it came down to is, there's another individual on the team. I mean, biggest brown noser ever. And he just favored him because he was comfortable with him versus someone like me. I do agree, like sometimes I could be a little overwhelming, but it's just because I'm trying to get things done, and I'm very motivated to see something finish. And he was just so uncomfortable with me. But I asked him, I was like, what's the issue? I was just like, I don't understand. How could you not be happy about all the inputs I gave you for your great output? And, he had nothing to say. So that right there was like a red flag for me. And like I said, you have to have the courage to defend yourself. It's a lot of, yes, you can go to your peers and start crying about it, but nothing is going to get done. It's always just going to happen again. That's like the way I look at like some managers, when they get away with something like that, they're just like, I'm going to be able to do it again. And it is a very tough thing to do, especially in a corporate setting. But if you are confident in your ability and you do it professionally and do the right things by the book, you can always defend yourself and overcome it. That's how I did it. And that ultimately led me to a VP role. So being able to speak up for yourself will help you in so many different ways.
Thank you. So I don't know who else would like to go, but
I can go. So, all right. So a year after I graduated from SUNY Oswego, I moved to Minnesota. So, big city boy here. I'd never been to the Midwest before. And I only went to Minnesota because I met a friend while working abroad. And she's like, oh, I'm from Minnesota. And I guess at that time, some changes happened and I saw this AmeriCorps position. And I was like, oh, working with kids, I love that. Let me just do it. And I'm an adventurous person. And so I just ended up going. And so that was a big learning curve. So in Minnesota, they have this thing called Minnesota Niceness, which is also known as passive aggressiveness. And that was, it was really challenging there because working in the professional setting, like a school and having ideas, I was a youth development specialist. And so I'm advocating for African-American students, thinking about school to prison pipeline, participating in a lot of these sessions around how do we engage students and keep them into classrooms longer. And I remember at a meeting with a bunch of teachers saying, white teachers too, because 4% of the teacher workforce is of students of color in Minneapolis, who are saying, well, they're going to suspend students if they're disrespectful. And I thought that was going back, not moving forward, right? Because when we're talking about the dignity of students, we don't suspend and throw them out of school, but we have to repair harm. And so voicing my concern about that and advocating for students was very unsettling. And I remember, keep in mind, I was like an AmeriCorps volunteer. So this happened right before I became a teacher. I remember the principal, who were a Black woman, had went to my supervisor and said, we no longer want to have Femi at North High School. And my supervisor said, why? She's like, because he was at a meeting with teachers and they felt that he was rude and disrespectful, and it made them feel uncomfortable. These are white teachers who are framing my narrative as being rude and disrespectful and angry for simply expressing, emotionally my discontent of this idea of pushing Black students out of schools. And I built relationships with kids who just don't have caring adults. And so imagine being in this place where that implicit bias and not giving an opportunity to repair, to seek understanding, to be disenfranchised, that was hurtful. I was hurt. And so that was the introduction to, Minnesota niceness and implicit bias. And so when I went on to become a teacher, I started to experience the same thing. And at the time, I didn't know how to deal with it. But I also studied communication. I focused on intercultural communication from a public relations standpoint. So I do understand, the theories and the practices of, negotiating meeting in an intercultural context. And so in this context, I will say that what's important in these workspaces is that, and going back to what Tina said, introspection, I had to really learn what is my communication style and how is that connected to culture? Because when somebody of power, especially when you're Black or Asian or Native American, or Latinx or Middle Eastern and et cetera, and you working in, a school or a business and you're expressing yourself, you come from a community that express differently, that deals with conflict differently. In my case, I'm the angry Black man and I am combative. And how I dealt with that is by asking, so let's define what it means to be angry. Because in Minnesota, their communication style, they're accommodators. They don't like conflict. And they are from a high context culture, which means that they rely a lot on, like, relationships takes longer to build. They rely on implicit messages and expect that you understand them. And they don't like conflict. They conflict avoiders. And from my microculture, I come from a community of people who is emotionally expressive. And being expressive is rooted in authenticity. And I also am conflict engaged. And I enjoy engaging in conflict to seek understanding. So trying to, like, tell them that, like, I'm not angry, but I'm conflict engaged. I'm not. And not only that, but I'm emotionally expressive, and that's cultural, just as much as you implicit and conflict averse, and how that's cultural. So how do we meet in the middle? But when you control my narrative and say I'm angry, that sets a precedent in how people can mistreat me. So my advice to you entering this workforce is really, like, sit and think about who you are. Are you someone who engages in conflict? Are you someone who's emotionally restrained, where you don't like to, express yourself as much? Because you can still be Black and still be emotionally restrained, right? But it's important to understand your communication style and how you deal with conflict, because silence is also something that a lot of Americans generally don't like. And so that's kind of my advice to you, is think about who you are as a person culturally. Think about how you navigate these spaces, so that when somebody tells you that you're angry or you need to speak up more because you're silent, that you can counter that by saying, well, this is cultural. And you're not commenting on me, but you're commenting on a culture and expecting me to converge to your culture and what's normal for you. So that's my advice for you when navigating these spaces.
Femi, that's such a good one, because I did a year in Buffalo and it was the same exact setting. And then I only did the year for a reason, because that's exactly how it was. And then I went to Philly and that was like a normal thing. Everybody just being loud and expressing themselves. So that was a really good one. Just wanted to share.
And yeah, Femi, I love that you spoke about how some things are personal and not cultural, and that you're generalizing the culture, not who I am, and accommodating me for me just because I don't fit what you think. And that's deep. A lot of people don't realize there's a difference in the two. And just because, like Yousef was saying, with, like, the name, you expect to see a certain person, you expect to see a certain thing, but that's you looking at the lens of through a culture, not off of who that person is. So I really respect that. And we do have a question from one of our students, from one of our attendees. Hannah is asking, what advice would you give me, an African student that is looking into a career of law enforcement? That's a good question. Definitely a good question. And I'll let whichever one of you guys definitely go ahead and tackle that.
That's such a tough question because of what's been going on
Mhm.
the past couple of years. It's I know plenty of African American cops, but a lot of them, like, see being a police officer in two ways. It's a good boys club, 100%, and they have to defend their brothers. Or do you have that one random cop that will stand up and do the right thing? But that is such a tough decision to make. It is not an easy decision to make, because you'll get shunned. I mean, I can't really give a clear and honest answer for that, but I would say just do the right thing and whatever you believe in, stick to your morals.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else have anything else to share? Femi, it looks like you want to press them. Okay.
Well, because I got,
Yeah.
I got so deep with the law enforcement. No, it's not. But so here's the problem with law enforcement, and I think this is also a problem with diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives in general. But especially with law enforcement, they hire for diversity, but they onboard for fit. And what that means is that they love numerical representation, but they don't want you to bring your own cultural perspective and practice into organization. They expect you to converge. And that's why you have the blue wall of silence, right? And that's why you have homogenous practices. And that's why you have silence or you're accommodating other communication styles because they don't recognize cultural difference. You have to do status quo and be homogenous and do what we want you to do. And so my advice for you is really pushing beyond those boundaries, right? Is don't be a diversity hire, right? But come in and challenge perspectives that they have about a community of people that is rooted in implicit bias. When we're talking about crime, we don't necessarily think about the root of crime. We solve it with we love to approach these things with technical problems instead of adaptive challenges. So, we address crime and Black people killing Black people, their favorite thing of saying it in that specific context of, well, we just put more cops on the street. That's a technical problem. That doesn't address the solution right there. And it doesn't address bias. And then they try the technical problem too, how they want to address like the whole killing Black people with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. It's like, well, let's hire more Black police officers or more police officers of color. That's a technical problem. It's not adaptive. It doesn't change anything. How do you do the people work and change the perspectives of the police officers, the implicit bias that they have of other people? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you do a one and done diversity, equity, and inclusion training, right? Because those things tend to focus on system change, not people change. That's where my work come in, working on intercultural learning. How do you learn for difference and negotiate in those contexts, right? Negotiate meaning in those contexts. So if you're a white police officer, right? Or even a Black police officer who's working in those communities who carry that internalized racism or bias, what is fueling that? What direct experience do you have with that? And how do you challenge that? And how do you really build intentional relationships with these people? And so that's what's really missing. And so if you're going into like the law enforcement field, I really would say like your work is going to be on the people change, not necessarily the system change. And that's the true work of diversity, equity, inclusion. Don't start from the top and work down. Let's hire more people and then everything is going to magically change. No, how do you get people to go from ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism? How can they feel comfortable in that discomfort and say, wow, this must be like, this is culturally different and I'm okay with that. And it's not that, they are loud and up to no good. It's that they're emotionally expressive in this community. Like that's important, right? And how music is important when they're blasting their music loud in the streets, right? So those things are really important to think about the values we have as a country and as individuals and as a community and challenge that and change it. And so that's where the work happens. It's like people change, not system change. That comes later.
Yousef, were you going to say something else? Okay.
I'm bad at turning my mute on, sorry.
It's okay. But thank you so much for that question. And just to add on to everything Femi was saying, I definitely agree. Definitely be an advocate for change. And like Yousef was saying, just be yourself. All you can do is bring you to the forefront and let people understand who you are and try your best to be a voice for your morals, your views, and what you stand for. And just make sure you stand 10 toes on that, because a man that doesn't believe in anything or have a foundation definitely has nowhere that they're going. So definitely make sure you always just know what your foundation is. So this kind of helps to segue into my next question. So for professionals that are kind of experiencing some of these biases or may want to be an advocate in their workforce or their company, how could they go about it without feeling like they're like the sole educator? How could they go about, bringing up some of these biases and also helping to educate rather than just doing those one-off workshops and everything, even trying to get a conversation started about that? What kind of advice would you guys give on that one? And I hope I explained that properly. So let me know if you need me to reiterate it.
Yeah, I think this is an important question for our students in a number of ways. I think of this not just as someone who has my own experiences in this area, but also as an administrator of our institution who works with many college students in internship opportunities. One of the conversations I have to have a lot of times with students is how to advocate for themselves with a supervisor. It all depends on the situation, of course. It depends on, I think, the industry that you're in, the type of bias you might be trying to work through, the type of situation that you have with your supervisor comes into play. Are you part of an organization that has culturally proven itself to be accommodating to interactive dialogue around these conversations? Or is it going to be something that you have to be even more strategic about because you are in a stereotypically conservatively discussed industry? I mean, in STEM, for example, being a female in STEM, if there are concerns as a female in STEM or someone who has a disability in STEM and a corporate world with a very technical hands-on area, I can speak from experience that it was a very long-winded process for me to be able to rise through the ranks to have the types of conversations that I had to have in order to create even a minuscule amount of change. It can be extremely disheartening. It can. You have to be mindful. You have to be mindful and have the ability to take others' perspectives into account, remembering that bias being implicit might be something that is a very difficult thing to approach for a lot of people. You're going to have a wide spectrum of, if you approach this person versus this person versus this person on these different hierarchical levels, how are they going to respond to that based on where they are in a company? But the biggest path forward is find the people who you do trust the most within an organization. Personally, I believe that students, depending on industries that they're in, should seek out opportunities where unions are present, should seek out opportunities where they know that the company they're about to work for does align with the same values that they have before they start working for them. Try to, as you enter the workforce, make sure that you're taking into the account that seeking out a company for yourself is kind of like dating. It's not just about impressing them. They should be impressing you too in these areas. If you have experienced bias of any type as a student, based on your identity and the communities that you are a part of, then it is really time as a student to think about how that could potentially filter through into your career and into your professional life. So be mindful now so that you are preparing yourself. You are talking to alumni, like these wonderful alumni who are sharing their experiences. Build yourself a network of mentors if you haven't already. Shout out Ask program. And really take advantage of the people you have in your court and take as many opinions from them as possible so that they can share their experiences. You can take away as much as you can from the different people they've interacted with in overcoming their conflict so that you can kind of mesh together your situation and a path forward for yourself. It's more long-winded than I had originally planned, but.
Oh, thanks for sharing, Tina. And, just to kind of like follow up on that, in my organization, I participate in this group called the Voice of the Employee. And within that group, I head diversity and inclusion. So, we're a resource. So, just for the students going into jobs, most of your companies should have a resource. Like, for example, I kind of just send correspondence based on a specific event going on and whatnot. But, a unique story I have to share because I was completely not aware of this. And, I wrote a nice little blurb for National Disability Awareness in December. And I was not aware at all that we had a blind employee within our company. And, she reached out to me and I was just like, and I have access to all like the important people to kind of just increase the exposure. And we did a 30-minute lunch and learn. And her story is pretty amazing. And the struggles, like just to kind of give brief background, she has zero privacy. Anything like training related, correspondence related, a fellow employee has to like read it to her and everything. But you know, I was the one that it was a very fulfilling event for me because you know I was able to arrange it for her. She was able to tell her story. It really changed the mind of a lot of individuals, the way they present, being more cognizant of you know the lack of technology she has. It you know a lot of the right people heard her story, and now we're really gaining some traction to make her her day better because you know she's an asset to us and she's a great individual. It stinks that you know well it's not fair that she has a disability, but we have to help her along the way. So there'll always be somebody there to help out. You just have to either find them or just ask.
And on the other side of that too, Yousef, like what you did for your coworker, if you as our students and current Lakers entering the workforce are able to be that advocate, even if it's not you and you're overcoming your own bias and you have a coworker who is overcoming their own conflict, be who Yousef was to his coworker. Because I can tell you right now, in experiences that I had through corporate STEM, I was actually the only female on a team of 14 men. And those men became like my brothers. And they advocated for me every step of the way throughout every process that I had to go through. They were a voice for me. They backed me every step of the way. They did not back down from a corporate ladder. And I can very easily relate to how your coworker must have felt to have that done for them.
She was, you know, I can't even explain how happy she was, and it was the least I could do. So just happy it happened.
I'm like, do I give an example or I give you a list? Somebody, okay, so I think that so if you when that question was stated, I was thinking about how do you get buy-in, which is kind of the biggest issue in organizations. And so there's so many different like factors to it, and I've kind of like written things down. But I think the number one is that meet people where they at. And early in my career, I never met people where they were at. You know, I come from a family of activists, and the way I've came to understand DEI is about being an agitator and disrupting. And oftentimes we don't ask a lot of critical questions and we don't bridge differences. So I expect people to be where I need them to be, not where they are currently at. And what that means is that you have to kind of take a step back and do that perspective taking, which that's something that Tina was just saying, right? It's like observing and taking perspective. Where are people? Are we talking about people, right, as colleagues? Are there some colleagues who are coming from communities where they miss difference, right? They never had a cultural interaction. They're not from New York City. Maybe they're from like a rural community, and this is their first time living in an urban environment or a community that's diverse. Then you have to understand that they are not necessarily going to understand things around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might have people that's polarizing, right? It's this us versus them perspective. And that's coming from a pain of hurt. And I can see, like, for an example, you can have like an African-American who will say descendants of slaves, who will look at Africans and say, oh, you think you're not Black. And that's a us versus them mentality, right? And so what is driving that? Historicize that perspective to see what's driving that division. You may have some people who de-emphasize difference, who's like colorblind. We're all human. And you have to observe that and see where that's coming from. Maybe because cultural difference make them feel uncomfortable, right? And then you have people who's probably like me, who's traveled and interact with different cultures, and we engage with it. We love when there's difference because we learn from it. And there are different types of profiles of people coming from different communities, and it's important for you to meet them where they are at. This work is hard. The work of social change is very hard. A lot of it is communication. A lot of it is like perspective taking. It's like being patient. I had to learn that very early on because I realized just telling you that you are ignorant and culturally incompetent is just, it's not going to work. The minute that you put that on them and judge them, then you already lost that buy-in. They're not going to even want to engage in conversation with you because they don't feel safe. And I know that sounds a little, and what's important too is like power and privilege, right? Because there is power and privilege in that dynamic, that influence it, and it's very complicated. It's a complex web. But what's important is like, you know, in order to practice human rights and, you know, restorative justice, we all have to be able to hear each other and really like try to get that buy-in and negotiate meaning, and that takes time. And the other thing I would say too is just like, if you want to affect change, asset mapping is really important. So go into that, not being the only person doing this work. You know, a lot of white people you're gonna have, and I'm saying explicitly white people, right, who predominantly run these industries or who overrepresented it. You're gonna get two types of white people. You're gonna get those who they care about social justice, but they don't know how to get there, right? Then you're gonna have those who get there, but because I don't want to be that white person who's on the wrong side of history. So they reject everything about their own cultural differences, right? And they're a yes person to everything around social justice. But then there are also the people who would, I'm going to hire a person of color just because I don't want to be seen as racist, but I won't give you the resources and empower them to be successful. And though you have that kind of white person. So it's important to think about that, like think about who you're dealing with and think about where your assets are in the organization. Who are your change makers who can move this forward, the influencers, and who are a little reticent, and how do you get them to get to that side where you need them to be? And that's how you affect change, is by doing that. And also thinking about the resources that you don't have. As an educator, as someone who was in teaching, who was a teacher, still in education, just not a teacher, but it's always this question of, we already know this, like they throw DEI stuff, trainings at us all the time. We know this already, but we don't have the resources. We don't have the staff. We don't have the time to do the curriculum planning. We don't have the time to get involved with the community because of all of these like stipulations coming from the federal and state government. And so that's important. If you have policies that sometimes get in the way of, you know, taking the time necessary as a team to reflect and grow. So think about what resources you need, whether they're human resources, whether it's time, like these are things that's really important, and use that as a source of advocacy to affect change.
Thank you, Femi. And that also kind of had me thinking, you know, what you were speaking about not only goes towards the employer or the person who's working there, the employee, but also the employer, where they should figure out what their resources are and how to advocate a bit for them. So I guess a question I guess I can throw out there for you guys, how would you give that advice to the employer? So a lot of these students here want to be entrepreneurs, want to go out and have their own business and do their own thing, but they don't really understand that DEI is something that definitely needs to be advocated and placed within a lot of these businesses. And how can they go out there and make that change? I know, Femi, what you were saying with, you know, some people they want to do the change, but they're not sure how to, or they're too afraid to. You know, how can we have more of Yousef, you know, stepping up and, you know, advocating for others? So on the employer side, what you guys think would be some good advice? Or if you could speak to those employers that you experience those biases with, what are some advices you would give them to change things, to be more inclusive and to eliminate some of those biases that stand? If you had any.
That's a tough question.
I was about to say, you know, don't get in your feelings now. They're not here.
We're thinking after hours now. No, I'm just kidding. So I mean, my firm, we've been pretty progressive. Like, I mean, we have had the first female CEO for our bank, and you know, but it was like Femi said, like we needed change, but they would make it happen, but not know what to do with it. So I know our biggest focus is really education, because being in the banking world, there are some ancient people that I work with, and they just kind of stuck in their ways. And you know, when it was during the riots where they started one of our head HR individuals was just doing a lot of educational pieces on why this is such an issue, because people are like, I just don't get this. I don't understand what the big deal is, why everybody is causing a ruckus and all that good stuff. But I remember one lady just saying, like, she's like, listen, I am 72 years old. I really just don't even pay attention to things anymore. But thanks for sharing because it's making me aware of my team dynamic. My team is not diverse at all. And just the list goes on. So just kind of like it ranges. It also depends like where you work too. Some places are so big, it's so hard for that top leadership to manage things like at a lower level. And they really rely heavily on these line managers, but not everybody is a good leader. You know, you have your leaders that could be great managers and help individuals grow and get that education. But then you have your other individuals who claim to be leaders, but all they could do is micromanage and say yes, and there's no progression or anything. So I really think it depends on the setting you have, who your audience is, and who's willing to make that progression.
Tina, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
It's more just thinking for a minute because it is such a hard question. I mean, I work with so many employers and it's a different conversation depending on the employer. Because it's not just about who the employer works for, it's about who you have that you're talking to in that moment. Is it someone who's actually supervising someone? Is it a director of a team? Is it an HR recruiter? They all have different perspectives. If I could speak to previous employers of my own, I would love to see them be open to deprogramming themselves, like truly committing to institutionalizing fairness in the way that they are becoming, at least making the attempt to become aware of their own biases. And I think, I mean, that's an active step. That is not just something that you stumble upon. It's something that you need to actually reflect on. And people are either willing to do that or they're not. I don't think it's necessarily something that having one simple conversation makes someone all of a sudden willing to reflect on that. It's a process, but I think it goes back to what I said previously about perspective taking and trying to make connections with someone to really first understand their perspective on something before you are trying to see in what areas you can help them reframe that. Femi, do you have anything? I was going to say, Femi, I'm sure you have something to add after that.
So there's the work of Ronald A. Heifetz where he talks a lot about technical problems versus adaptive challenges, and I mentioned that earlier. And I would send you the resources. Anything I mentioned, I'll send it to the team so that y'all can distribute it. But so when you're engaging with the top level executives, what's important is to get them to think about in terms of leadership, which is really coming from that, about what is a technical problem and how do we address this as an adaptive challenge. So let's take, for an example, the corporate world, right? My least favorite, but we're gonna work with that. If you're dealing with the corporate world, they throw a lot of money at diversity, equity, inclusion, but what we have seen over the past few decades is that the numbers are not changing. And so it's wasting money, right? And that's a technical problem, as I stated earlier, because the way we are addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, as we don't want to be sued and we want to be perceived as doing the right thing. We are reactive, not proactive. And as someone working in, whether you're a consultant, an intern, an employee, union, not union. What is important is to get your team and leaders to understand that just throwing money and hiring for diversity is not going to solve the problem. But how do we adapt to the times? So if we hire for diversity, then what resources do we need to empower them? How do we hire directly from the pipeline, build community partnerships to recruit more diverse people that are sustainable and that's adaptive, right? What kind of people work needs to happen? And one resource that I think will be really important is thinking about how do we measure for intercultural competence. And one robot, there's so many measurements or metrics out there, but I do think that one that's really popular is the Intercultural Development Inventory. That's something that I use in my work with in consulting in the education space, but doing organizational assessments of where we at as an organization. Are we ethnocentric or are we ethno-relative? And that's really important to think about. So when I talked about, people who never had difference, those are people who are, coming from a very denial space of they don't see cultural difference and it's always a me perspective. And those are the type of metrics you want to use to measure individual intercultural competence as well as organizational intercultural competence. Use that metrics to inform your work and how you want to affect change. And also, I used to be idealistic, I'm still am, right? But I think it's important to have a big picture and then work on doing small changes to get those big results, right? And so I think buy-in is the most important because there's strength in numbers and that's gonna lead into big results. I also think like Adrienne Marie Brown, I love her. She's very popular in like Minneapolis and I was influenced by her work, but she talks a lot about like, she's against cancel culture and so am I. I think it is a necessary tool, but I think that oftentimes it doesn't repair harm. We don't give people the opportunity to make mistakes and we don't expect them to, or we expect them to know things that they don't know. And so I think what's important is that allow people to make mistakes, especially because when we working with white people, and my work working with white people a lot, the fear is not that they want to engage, but they're afraid to be canceled and be like, oh, there you go, you're racist, you said something that was up. And that is problematic. And it's also problematic too when you're a person of color and you have bias, but you don't necessarily think about the kind of harm you cause. Like as someone who, before wasn't really thinking about people who was living with a disability, right? And unintentionally causing harm, which is literally the definition of racism. It could be intentional or unintentional, and I'm unintentionally causing harm with implicit bias. So it's important to think about that as well, right? Even if they're a person of color, they have a bias, and a lot of people of color in power, because we do have power, don't necessarily think that they can be racist or cause harm. And it's important to say you do have a bias and you have power that would disenfranchise people. So I think that's also important. And then thinking about what's important in this work, and I will say this right now, data analytics is so important. I can't tell you that much. In the United States, specifically in the DEI space, they love data, and I personally love it myself too, but I also love like anecdotal stories, but data will really inform your work. While you're in school, learn how to analyze data and learn how to interpret it. It's important to have that data, capture that, do that longitudinal study, whether there's surveys and focus groups, or whether they like quantitative data, right? Use that data to back your claim. That is really going to help you in the long run. When you identify the gaps, you can ask better questions about how we can affect change in an organization. And that's how you approach your upper management. It's by using that data as a tool for resources, saying the data doesn't lie. Because they respond to that over an anecdotal story. That will enhance our work, having that, but they will respond first to the data. So while you're in school, or if you graduated already and you just kind of chilling, learn about data analytics, learn how to interpret it so that you can use that for your work. And I will send you all that resource, but I think that those are really important things to think about as you are engaging in this work.
Femi is spot on. Like, this is a very data-driven world now. And when you're doing your projects and everything, if you don't have data backing you, a lot of people will nobody's going to take you for your word. So that's definitely a great pointer. And I wish I looked into it before I graduated. I hated stats class.
I like to compare it to resumes for students. Are you just going to walk into a job and say, yep, I can do this job? Or are you going to show them the data on that resume that you can do this job?
Right. So thank you guys so much. And this kind of segues into our next question, which is, if you're, of course, comfortable in sharing, have you yourself been involved in implicit bias or participated in implicit bias, and how did you go about making that change? I know, Femi, what you were saying with cancel culture, I personally hate cancel culture. I think it makes no sense, personally canceling somebody or being upset with someone because they make a mistake. People can always make changes. For myself, coming to Oswego, just like Femi, I grew up in the Bronx, grew up in a Jamaican household, grew up around nothing but Jamaican people, honestly. And coming to Oswego, not only was it a culture shock, of course, I've seen way more white people, but just different people. And I'm talking about different walks of life, Africans, Colombians, Latinos, all of that. And just being exposed to them and their culture and getting like a real taste of it. I love African music at this point. I love my Latino music at this point. Like, I was obsessed. I couldn't get enough. And that's why, I was so involved with Alana, because I was so submerged in all these different cultures that even though, I'm from New York City, where they got a little Jamaica, a little Italy, but honestly, the only real cultural fusion is like food. And that's as far as it went for me. So, being around people and hearing their music and, different language and what they idolize, even seeing that a lot of people had the same morals and values that you didn't even think had the same morals and values as you. So can you guys share a moment where you guys may have been participated in implicit bias, but changed it, and how did that change happen for you?
Yeah. So I am almost 6 years into working in higher education now. It's been a fun ride. I love working with students and I love working with the Gen Z population. I know when I first came back into working in higher education, it wasn't actually at SUNY Oswego. I know that at that point in time that the largest implicit bias that I had to overcome was age bias. I think that I came in real hot as working in higher education initially, thinking that I knew exactly what the students needed, regardless of how much time had passed since I was a student. Like, I knew what was the students that were younger than me, they needed me. They knew that they needed me. I knew that they needed me. And that is not at all my frame of my point of view at all anymore. It is not how I coach students. It is not how I work with them to create a very, very apparent equal playing field, a partnership, realizing that in every minute that I spend teaching them, I am also learning from them. Age bias is so easy to succumb to without realizing that it's happening. Absolutely guilty of that, for sure.
That is such a good one, Tina, because I wouldn't have even thought about it. But for example, I'm the youngest in my org. So I'm the youngest VP org, been at the bank the least time. And there's definitely a bias against me, like the way I approach things and everything. Because generally, like when you graduate college, unless you do like some of those analyst programs where it's all fresh grads, get ready to work with older people. And sometimes it can be a challenge. But it's also, learning experience. There's a lot that, seasoned employees have to offer. You just have to be kind of diplomatic about it. You can't go in there, I guess, headstrong, thinking you know everything because you've seen the technology changes. You got to do a little capstone project at school. These employees have been doing it for a while. So usually, as long as you're diplomatic and you have the right approach, it'll go well, and that bias will kind of disappear. Because for a while, when I took on this role, a lot of people were uncomfortable with me leading these projects because they're just like, how is this individual leading these projects? I've been here for 25 years. Yeah. I was like, don't worry, we could work together. We'll figure it out. So, and I mean, that's how I dealt with it.
Congrats on being the youngest VP for your company.
Just my org. That's it. Like, it was just, I got really networking. Network your butts off. It'll pay off.
Okay. That's the truth right there. So before I came to Oswego, I had a racial and gender bias. I was someone who went through internalized racism really heavy on my maternal side. My grandmother's from the South. She's in Tennessee. That's her ancestral land. And there were always messages around being darker skinned. And I love Black growing up. And so the negative messages I received always socialized me into thinking that dark skin was not beautiful. And that influenced how I interacted and what I found beautiful. And as a queer person, I was just not interested in dark skinned men. And that also influenced how I treated other people too. So I thought like people would, if you're dark skinned, you're ghetto, you loud, you ain't working hard enough. And then I also had a gender bias being queer, gay, a lot of growing up in the gay community. I will argue and say gay and queerness are very different things, but growing up in a boardroom culture, you see yourself as you're better than women and you can do it better than them. And then you receive messages from a mother. I received messages from a mother, which was very patriarchal and militant. And so that influenced how I viewed myself in comparison to women, and also did not hold myself accountable because, I'm queer, so I can't be sexist because, we're just as oppressed, right? And so that, when I got to Oswego, before I even got to Oswego, those things were looming over my head and really had created negative experiences with people, and how I overcame that. When I got to Oswego, I didn't participate in Alana so much because I was so much focused on like study abroad, getting out of school. But I immersed myself into like literature about women. Patricia Hill Collins, that's a Black woman writers class in SUNY Oswego, with Patricia Clark. I love bell hooks. So every book that I've read and read up until this day is about Black women and women in general. But I wanted to have a specific focus on like Black women experience, which was always about like they are the last to get the plate, as they would say, right? When we think about power and privilege. And to challenge my own perspective and really feel uncomfortable with that. The other thing I had to really do was just think about like critical race theories is hot button topic, but that really does help you examine the messages, like how race play a role in law, but also in education, also in social spaces, reading about internalized racism to really make sense of why I felt this way about myself. As a teenager, and why I wanted to live in Europe, and I romanticized it. And so that reading and engaging in conversations was very uncomfortable, and having friends who really challenged me helped. And that's how I learned how to overcome that. And today, right now, doing all this work, being a teacher, traveling, having exposure, because I do want to say having exposure doesn't necessarily mean that you made it and you're culturally competent. You got to do the work. Like your work never ends there. But now I focus on like to your point, Tina, age bias and disability, right? And age bias specifically because generation perspectives, like baby boomers and their perspective of work culture. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't want to work a 9 to 5, that anytime I see somebody from the baby boomer, era, I have perspective about them already. And I'm already reading books now about a book about, that was through Pew Research, about generational perspectives and the attitudes and practices that they have. And that helps me think about how I can negotiate meaning in these contexts and see where they are coming from and try to like bridge those differences. And disability is a big thing because I could tell you right now, previously I was someone, I don't even want to look at articles about people living with disability. I don't want to. One time I was mentoring someone who was visually impaired, and I was so uncomfortable because at first I was like, I don't I'm not the person to do this. Like, I don't even have the right language to support this person. And I was uncomfortable because it's like, oh, they visually impaired. That's more work for me. And I had to really do some work and think about why I'm uncomfortable. Where is that coming from? And I learned a lot from that person, from that mentee, just taking on that challenge to change my perspective. And now my work consists of, anytime I'm working on a project, I'm talking about universal design for learning. How are you designing spaces and curriculum that's accommodating all ability types, right? And now I'm talking about, that's kind of the focal point of my work now. I was thinking about disability folks first, right? Before we could talk about able body, and thinking about how do we include people from older generation into these younger conversations. And so I really say the work happens with you. Try your best to recognize that, identify that you have a bias, and really do that work. Read literature about it. There's tons of articles about that stuff that will really support your growth and bridging those differences, and have conversations with people who are like that. I always like to ask the question, how diverse is your universe? If you don't hang out with people, like in my case, if I'm not hanging out with people who are living with disabilities or who are a different age of me, then I'm not doing enough, right? Because that means when I leave work, I'm going back to a community that shares the same perspective as me. And so you have to diversify your universe, intentionally hang out with people who are different from you, work with them, because there's a lot that you can learn about them that will impact you. And that's exactly how I did this work. So it's not perfect. There's things that I still work through in all four of those categories, right? I still work through them, but I'm able now to, when I feel something deep down inside, I'm like, wait a minute, I got a bias. Now I need to check this. And that's because I've done that work early on.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to me too that when we talk about different types of implicit bias, that affinity bias is always a topic that's mentioned too. Because to me, affinity bias, being just gravitating towards people that are similar to you, is just kind of inherently why bias is generated in the first place in my mind. So it's always difficult for me to understand that concept as a separate concept. But yeah, I mean, even affinity bias, like what you were just talking about, is surrounding ourselves with friends and people who we've chosen in our own lives who are similar to us. And how are we really breaking that down and saying, you know what, I'm not super comfortable because I don't know a lot about your situation, but that makes me want to gravitate towards you instead of be adverse to a relationship with you. Absolutely.
Thank you. So thank you all for sharing. Is there any questions in the audience for the panelists? No pressure, of course. Okay, so I just want to thank each of you guys for coming and speaking today. All of the knowledge and experience, of course, that you guys shared is truly, truly appreciated today. So we'd also love to hear, oh, sorry, reading my notes. So sorry. So we'd also love to hear from you guys who attended, what you learned from tonight's presentation. And we will post a quick poll at the end of the presentation for you guys. That's in the chat. Malcolm just added. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of all those that participated, and a huge thank you again to each of our panelists. Your insights and perspectives were powerful as always. Don't forget to check out more engaging programs for Imagine 2022. Next week, Imagine Excelling. Here's a checklist for this week that will keep you moving forward in your career journey. You can check it out in the chat. Alrighty, so thank you everyone. Have a great night. And this recording will be up on the Imagine website very soon, so you can check it out. Thank you guys.
Go Lakers.
Go Lakers. Have a good night, everyone.